What's a healthy concentration of vitamin D in the body?
What are the levels of vitamin D in people who live way out in the plains of Africa and live out in the sun day by day?
And how does that correlate with health today? I lived overseas. I lived in Norway. After that, I lived in Iceland, and later on ended up having extremely low vitamin D levels.
Because of that, until I could get my levels up to an adequate level again, it seemed like when people around me were sick, I'd often end up getting sick myself.
And it's amazing what happened once I got my levels of vitamin D up, how your body just has the ability to fight off disease even when it's all around you. So we're going to look at the data, the research that's out there on vitamin D levels, maybe how much we should have, and how it might change your life. Hey everybody, Chad Cruiser here with Health and Homestead. Let's dive into the research looking specifically to begin with on hunter-gatherers and their vitamin D levels. Scientists in the British Journal of Nutrition looked at African tribes and their vitamin D levels. The two tribes studied were the Maasai and the Hadzabe, and the Maasai had an average circulating vitamin D concentration of 47.6 nanograms per milliliter, and the Hadzabe had 43.6, and the average of both tribes was 46 nanograms per milliliter. Looking at what might be normal levels in the upper 40s, close to 50, what would happen if you took people and you had those levels of vitamin D in the midst of COVID? Researchers published a meta-analysis in the journal Nutrients examining vitamin D levels and COVID-19 mortality or levels of death. And you can see the higher toward the left, the mortality coefficient, that people with lower levels, if you look at the bottom, you see their vitamin D levels. The lower they were, the more likely they were to die. And as you head down and to the right, you see less and less death. And you can see right there around 50, what do they end up stating? The study suggests that based on combined data from multiple studies, a theoretical vitamin D level of 50.7 nanograms per milliliter would theoretically reduce COVID-19 mortality to 0. Now, keep in mind, this is theoretical. That doesn't mean nobody would ever die if they had a vitamin D level of 50 or above, but it just means that potentially at that level, very few people would be likely to die, because vitamin D in the body, whether you call it a hormone or a vitamin or whatever you call it, seems to be something that enhances immune function in human beings significantly, and people with less vitamin D are less able to fight off pathogens in the body.
Now, in the United States, on average, the vitamin D level is 28 nanograms per milliliter.
You may have heard during COVID that people who supplemented once they got sick, that it didn't work as well. Now, it is probably true that you'd be better off having plenty of vitamin D already in your body before you come down with a sickness, but when they gave high-dose vitamin D to people, we're talking like 20,000 international units, 50,000 international units for several days. Now, you don't want to do that all the time because you can overload on vitamin D, and we're not suggesting that someone do that. In the midst of the pandemic, when people were taking this, that they did see a drop in COVID mortality when giving people high-dose vitamin D. And the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism reports that people who have lower vitamin D levels versus those who are barely sufficient, these are like very low levels, having 14.6 versus only 20, are more likely to have long COVID. You may know people that are still suffering to this day with long COVID. I mean, they may have had COVID 6 months ago or even more, and they're still feeling tired, they're feeling weak, they're having brain fog, and having 14.5 nanograms per milliliter is very low, and 20 is like hardly sufficient. I mean, it's like the bottom level, and yet even that makes a significant difference in coming down with long COVID. And so what if they had rather 30 or 40 or closer to maybe almost 50 like the hunter-gatherers historically might have had? Might it be that many of these people, I'm not saying it's the only factor, but might that be something that they could do to get their blood levels of vitamin D up? Might it help them overcome this issue with long COVID, and might it also help them to better fend off other pathogens that come in the future? A study in PLOS ONE looked at vitamin D levels in cancer. The study showed that increasing serum vitamin D levels, a key measure of vitamin D in the blood, from 20 nanograms to 40 nanograms per milliliter, was linked to an impressive 65% reduction in cancer risk. Overall, with all the data, in practical terms, this means that for individuals with levels at 20, the likelihood of developing cancer dropped by about 4/5, when their levels reach 40 nanograms per milliliter. This is a chart looking at cancer rates by baseline vitamin D levels. This is the adjusted hazard ratio of cancer to vitamin D levels in a pooled cohort, and on the left side it's the adjusted hazard ratio for cancer. And notice this is the lower levels, massively higher levels of hazard for cancer, and it goes down, down, down as you have higher levels of vitamin D. So meaning more vitamin D,
a lower hazard ratio for cancer.
The active form of vitamin D is one of the most potent preventers or restrainers of cancer, researchers suggest, and has been shown to have an anti-proliferative impact on melanoma, leukemia, breast, prostate, and lung cancer cells. What about insufficient sun and vitamin D? Researchers reporting in the journal Phytochemistry and Photobiology estimate that 50,000 to 63,000 people die a year, this is back in 2007, in the US from lack of sunlight or vitamin D. The same year, less than 8,500 people died in the US from melanoma. Research in the journal Melanoma Research looked at people who have either regularly supplemented with vitamin D or those who did not. It turned out that 18.1% of people who regularly supplemented with vitamin D either had or had melanoma versus 32.3% of those who did not supplement. And the point in sharing this is many people are terrified to go out in the sun because they're afraid of getting melanoma, and it is true that sunburn may be a factor in coming down with melanoma, but much of the research shows that it's not sunlight itself that causes the melanoma, but it's more sunburn, that people that are habitually out in the sun who don't get burned are less likely often to come down with various cancers, even many times skin cancer. Researchers gave men with metastatic prostate cancer 2,000 international units of vitamin D a day, and it lowered prostate-specific antigen, or PSA, levels in less than 2 years. Colorectal cancer. The Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology reports that women who were vitamin D deficient were at 253% increased risk of coming down with colorectal cancer. One of the questions you might be asking is, how much vitamin D can the body produce as the sunlight hits the skin and turns a certain form of cholesterol through a process into vitamin D? How much vitamin D can be produced by the body from the sun in one day? The National Institutes of Health suggest an intake of about 600 to 800 international units of vitamin D per day. Researchers estimate that in the right circumstances, the body can produce 25,000 international units a day from the sun. Anywhere from about 10,000 to 25,000 per day in optimal conditions, and they suggest, 600 to 800 international units. And I think for many people, if you have adequate vitamin D levels and you're just trying to keep it there, that may be optimal. But for those who are significantly lower, if you have low vitamin D, there are many people who try. You take 600, 800 week after week, month after month, and your vitamin D never gets up. Now, if you can just get it from the sun, that's phenomenal. But if you're not and you're still low, I lived up in Iceland, and I later on was back in the States, very low in vitamin D. So for people who are low, you might want to supplement. And I'm not telling you what to do, but until you get up to an adequate amount, you might be wanting to take significantly more than 600 to 800 international units a day. Researchers in the Journal of Steroid Biochemistry and Molecular Biology had 4,700 people take 5,000 to 50,000 international units of vitamin D. Most patients reported in this journal would take somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 a day for years. And they did not have vitamin D-induced hypercalcemia in any of these people, though most may not need 10,000 international units a day. So one of the things people are worried about is that you can get what's called hypercalcemia. And many people are suggesting, well, you've got to take K2 with it so that you don't have this hypercalcemia, too much calcium in the blood. Well, I'm not so convinced that's the case yet. It may be maybe some preliminary research on that. I don't think it's really solid to say that at this point. But these people doing it for years, taking 5,000 to 10,000 for years, none of these patients evidently had hypercalcemia from taking high-dose vitamin D daily for years. They have a report on an asthmatic using 25,000 international units a day for years and it helping with asthma. They also report on an individual with psoriasis using 50,000 international units a day and it helped clear all signs of psoriasis. Now, I'm not telling you to take these levels. Now, sometimes a doctor may prescribe 50,000 international units, maybe once a week for a while until you get up to adequate levels. But these are just some interesting kind of anecdotal stories, almost kind of like a case report in this particular scientific journal. They also report on a person with an ulcerated skin condition that was treated with 60,000 international units a day for years with marked improvement. The best way to find out that you don't have too high levels, or too low levels for that matter, is to go be tested. Have blood work done, ask them to check your vitamin D levels, and so that you don't get too high or too low.
I also have a video on the impact of vitamin D on ovarian cysts and menstrual issues, so you may want to check that out.
If you have any suggestions for a video, please suggest down below in the comments section. If you like this video, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notifications. God bless and have a fantastic day.